Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, tell us a bit about your approach. You know, when if you can think back to situations where you finished a project, you're moving on to another. How does that work? Do you ever engage in that question about what
What's
do I
next?
do now?
What's
Right.
next? Now that I think about it, I haven't thought about this before, so this is totally
Yeah.
on the fly here, you're right. But now that I think about it, it does seem like a lot of my projects have kind of come out of a question that I was asked nearing the end of the last project that I hadn't really kind of thought of, but that opened up a whole set of things I should have probably thought of. And let me think if I can think of an example. Like this question of the issue I'm working on now is border hardening in some sense. And I remember getting a question when I had presented a paper on human trafficking and the diffusion of human trafficking policies. I remember getting a question sort of towards the end of that about, well, you know, you're arguing that these roadways are places of where externalities can cross from one country to the other. The diffusion argument hinged on that, and they said, but how do you know they're open? Because a lot of roads are guarded. I said, we don't know that. Next, you know, and so, but then that kind of stuck in my mind as kind of an interesting question, and that it would be kind of good to know that. I filed that away in my head, and then I serendipitously just met some people who work with like GPS and realized that we can find out the answer to that, and not only can we find it out just to have answered that question, but it's actually an interesting issue in itself. Why states spatially array their symbols of authority at their border crossings, and sometimes they don't. So started just as a sort of testing case to go after that. But anyway, to answer your question, well, and then the world intervenes, and it turns out that borders are becoming extraordinarily sensitive places. So that's really the one that sort of tipped it over into like really kind of making this the center of the next inquiry. But the thing that sort of just nudged me a little bit in that direction was an unanswered question from the previous project.
And would you say that pattern is pretty common, looking back at your career?
I can think of one other instance in which it was, and that was presenting a paper one time. Again, it kind of was in this human trafficking space, and we were looking at, I was working with Judith Kelly, and we were thinking of, we're sort of using the data that the State Department puts together on how hard you're trying to eliminate your trafficking. And again, there was this issue of somebody asked the question about, why is that an indicator of human trafficking? Isn't that just what the U.S. State Department decides? Because they give you an indicator,
right,
of how hard you're trying on this. So we went back and we looked at each other, we went like, that, of course it is. And it turns out there's this big literature on the use of ratings and rankings of states and, of course, firms and, of course, hospitals and law schools and universities and everything else about this kind of the power of the social pressure, the competitive pressure, and the market pressure, the kind of squeezing information into this kind of ranking framework can have. And so Judith and I went back and we totally took the project and, not flipped it, but, the interesting, we totally problemized the dependent variable, I think it was, went like that and said, what does that kind of explain, right? And reframed it essentially based on this one kind of really kind of good question that was, it was really perspective altering in some way. And it came from a talk where we both went, yeah, of course, and so we just threw that paper away. It wasn't even a build on paper. We just, like I said, we kind of flipped it completely to take this thing we were using as a dependent variable and say, no, it's something else. It's social pressure. It turned into a real fun project. We have a book coming out with Cambridge University Press on that. That's an edited volume where everybody that's contributed, chooses a subject area and kind of looks at where there are ratings and rankings. And so, for example, in that one, we use the ease of doing business indicators in the same kind of way. Anyway, so that's again sort of the same kind of thing. But that's not the.
Absolutely.
I have another major way too.
Go for it.
Should I?
Yes, please.
So this was the switch from kind of political economy to human rights,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and this was sort of from my dissertation topic to my next topic, and in this case, I wanted to do a book on kind of international law compliance, but I was going to have all this political economy, and I was going to have trade, and I was going to have monetary, I was going to have territorial stuff in it, and I was going to have some human rights in it. And I knew the most about the trade and the monetary. And I put an ad out for it. This was at UC Berkeley for research assistants, and asked people to say what their preference was to work on. So I get like 25 applications, and 23 of them are to do human rights. And it's like, what is the market telling me
Yeah,
here?
right,
You know,
right.
what do
Yeah.
people sort of care about, want to know, want to work on, have an interest in?
Yeah.
And I just tried this balancing act for a while, and I just realized the human rights part of it was just growing, and it had all the momentum, and I kicked the other parts away eventually, and it became a book on compliance with international human rights law.
Right. Which I
So that came from my students.
Yeah, which I think your Google Scholar profile says is your most cited
Yeah,
work.
that's right.
Yeah.
That and some of the diffusion stuff too. Yeah.
So in this case, if we can just think about this for a little bit, I mean, we all consider our audiences when we write, and this was a case where you were considering what are people interested in.
Can I even
right
back
now?
up one step? Because where did I get the idea to do a book on international law compliance? And one other thing I think is really very important is that I was teaching a class on international law. And this is like my second, third year as a junior professor. And, some kid just raises his hand and says, Professor Simmons, who cares about any of this? In so many words, said, international law doesn't really affect what states do anyway, so why is this important again? Tell us again why this is important. And I could not point to a literature back then. I could not point to a literature, in the mid-90s that addressed this issue. So I said, that's what, if I can't answer that question in a classroom, don't you think we maybe should be working on it? And it's such a core question.
Right.
Maybe we should be working on this. So that's how I got the idea for the international law compliance book in the first place, which was going to be multi-topic, and then went off into the human rights area.
Yeah.
In both cases, you can see how students were very crucial for me choosing the direction to go next.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so, is there, in looking at your extensive oeuvre, are there consistent themes, a consistent framework, consistent questions?
I've always been a liberal, for one thing. I've always been interested in rules and norms.
Yeah.
And kind of sort of an international rule of law kind of approach in a way that we could kind of understand sort of norms that everybody's going to follow, rules of behavior. So even in my political economy stuff, it was kind of like about the gold standard and everybody adhering to it or not. It was about how can we get back to liberalized trade after it was all broken up, during the problems, in the 1920s and 1930s. And so it was kind of like this problem of kind of how can we come back to this kind of rule-governed or norm-governed order. And that theme actually does go across to the human rights area.
So your work on diffusion would fit in.
The diffusion stuff does a bit too, because then the question is how do these norms and ways of doing things and how these policies sort of diffuse from one place to another. Yeah. So I do think there's a kind of a commonness there. And the other thing that's very common is, and the diffusion work is the least this, but I'm almost always looking for what are some of the domestic sources of some of this. So the diffusion research agenda is the least oriented towards the common domestic sources, and more looks at the kind of contagion across countries. That's sort of more the analytical focus. But all the other work, the human rights and the political economy work on the 20s and 30s, is domestic sources of. In fact, both of them are right there in the title,
Right.
So, so in that sense, I kind of just have a sort of a liberal approach to, and so that runs through a lot of my stuff right now.
And would you say
always has run through a lot of my stuff.
And so, would you say that you have a model kind of for the way the world works? And am Am I pushing you too
That's,
hard?
that's
on
way
this?
too much. That's giving me
It's going
way
too far.
too much coherence to the way I think. I really am a little bit more problem oriented than that.
I see.
I sort of, so I'm a Bob Cohane student. So, there's this kind of cooperation is sort of good. Rules are good. They help us do good things together. They improve outcomes generally overall. So I always had this kind of, to cooperate is a good thing, and to form laws and institutions help us achieve common goals. And that is kind of an orientation that I've always had.
Okay.
Yeah, but that comes because my advisor was Bob Cohane. Of course, I chose to work with Bob Cohane because I found that sort of an appealing way to think about the world. But yeah, I do think that way has some shortcomings to it for sure, and we're learning about some of them now. But nonetheless, I think that describes mostly what you're interested in. But there's nothing that coherent. Nothing that coherent.
Okay. And methodologically, would you describe yourself as fairly eclectic?
I would describe myself as whatever works,
Uh-huh.
whatever enlightens.
Right.
And if that means that we do interviews, then we do some interviews.
Right.
And if that means that we collect data, then we do collect data. One thing that it's very hard for today's generation of scholars to appreciate is that when I did my book, my dissertation, there was almost no quantitative work in international political economy. The quantitative work in IR was all correlates of war.
Right.
Nobody did quantitative IPE. Right. And so I had to justify to my advisors that we might want to do some quantitative work on exchange rates.
Yeah. Imagine that.
And so that was like not heard of at the time. Trade flows and things like this, and it just wasn't. It sort of really wasn't the way things were done at the time. And I can remember hearing like, "Do you really think this is going to add up to anything, Beth?"
Yeah.
And so that is to say, I do choose and find useful methodologies that aren't even popular at the time, a lot of times. And so that shows up in a lot of what I do today. So on my border project, for example, I do ethnography in the following way. I go to trade shows that sell border stuff.
Oh, that's cool.
And so I go and I talk to different firms about like what are they selling, what threat does it help to address,
Right.
what do you think the problem is out there?
Yeah.
How do you address it? Where else do you work? Where else does your firm sell things? Who are your other clients? Just get a sense of where around the world, if there were ever a diffusion angle to take up on this.
Right.
So anyway, so you can see how ethnography and what we do. Are you kidding? But I find it useful just sort of to help me interpret what else I'm looking at a lot of times. Yeah.
When you start out on a project, do you have the sense that you know what you're going to find, or
Sometimes.
Yeah.
It's always a big limb because will you, right? But sometimes I do. I definitely have a working hypothesis. And the best working hypothesis is it's interesting. Either way it goes, right? Either way is interesting. But I think also that descriptive work is undervalued. And I think that so much is just, I didn't know that. I just had not seen that before. I didn't even know that there was a trend. Never mind that I can't totally explain it in a convincing way right now. I think there's a lot of value in that. Yeah. So do I know the answer? No, I don't always know the answer. I certainly have expectations most of the time.
Right. To what extent would you say your work resonates with your personal biography?
I don't see it.
Okay.
I've never had my human rights violated knowingly.
Right. Yeah.
I've never been a practicing international law person. I've never been a diplomat. I've never been involved with exchange markets or trade. My life actually outside of the university is not any more international than anyone else's life, and a lot less international than most of my students' lives, to be honest,
Right.
So I don't know if we want to say that necessarily on the podcast to undercut my credibility. But the truth is, I don't see it. I don't see it at all.
Yeah. So it's an intellectual activity.
Yeah.
Okay. That's fair. And
The way it is.
well, it makes total sense to me. So, what advice do you give your doctoral students when they are hunting around for good topics to work on?
Just number one, just make sure you're interested in it.
Uh-huh.
That's just absolutely critical. Make sure that you have a curiosity about it.
Right.
If you're just sort of doing this because you're trying to market yourself in a particular way, you're going to get bored really quickly.
Yeah.
Or if you're doing it because you think your advisor thinks it's an interest, here, take my data set and try it,
Right.
Again, that's going to feel boring. It seems to me that the secret sauce is that you've got to be interested in it, right?
Right.
And there's another, in addition to that, it's super helpful if what it is you're trying to explain per se is important.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that is much more important than can you get the causality absolutely nailed. Mm-hmm. Because it seems to me that it is easier to maintain an interest in a project that you believe is important and you know what, that others kind of believe is important, because it takes a little bit of that reinforcement around you. That is such a good question. That is so interesting. I was wondering about that myself, this kind of interest thing, this inherently interesting question, or maybe something going on in the world or has gone on in the world, but nonetheless, it's got to be, I think you got to believe your dependent variable is important.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if a student comes in with an interest in a topic that's intrinsically interesting, well, of course, that's all good. But what about the students that don't walk in the door, into your office with that idea?
I throw them a few really good ideas.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I throw them a few. And then they get the idea like, oh, this is kind of fun to play with ideas, isn't it? So throw them a few ideas like, wow, I wonder if, like, this is, has anybody thought about that? And then you just have just play a little bit of, what do we call it? A sport where you hit something like badminton or ping pong or something. You just play a little bit of that, right?
Yeah.
Bounce it around a little bit. And so you can do that for a while. And then if they constantly are coming in with no ideas, these are the hard cases.
Right. And just a little bit more on the sort of the curriculum. One of the things that I worry about a little bit is that our courses are deadening. We throw all this literature at them. We ask them to remember it, spit it back.
In strange ways, college is deadening.
Uh-huh.
And some, really, I think you're right. Just to underscore that. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
yeah.
Is this something you share? But I guess the question is, if you feel that way, what is the live part? I mean, how could we make the
Do you mean when you
curriculum
teach?
more? Yeah, I mean, how does that, especially for graduate students, how do you communicate that excitement or make it a creative act rather than just a recitation of what the great authors have written?
I always start out, why would we want to know this?
Mm-hmm.
Why would we want to know this? What is this giving us an insight into that either gets us into adjacent areas that we truly are interested in? Like, start to think a little bit more laterally now. Take this, if this is such a useful theory, then tell me how it applies to something really interesting that you are interested in. And I think actually another good thing is to sneak bad literature in too. I think it is.
Yeah.
Because then don't tell them that you're doing it, of course, but just let them discover what's poor and why.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little bit of discovery too. And then they'll say, oh, this article was bad. And then you end up asking things like, well, what made it bad?
Right.
What about it? And they go, it just never did make its point. That tells you something about what you better watch out for. Make sure you have a point, right? Anyway, so you can use sometimes you can use bad literature for a pedagogical purpose. But I also find that it's always good to, when they get too much into the critical mode about the literature, is to say, well, then how would you have designed this? If you were interested in this problem, how would you have designed it? Mm-hmm. And try to get them to talk about that a little bit. And that gets the creativity going in positive ways as opposed to destructive ways. Mm-hmm. So that can be useful sometimes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then I find that, and you got to be really careful with this one because you've got to set it up just right. you've got to frame it right. Is if you assign your own work and say and frame it in the way, I need help. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Not, this is my great work from 10
Right.
years ago in the APSR.
Right.
Those are terrible discussions.
Yeah.
Something you're working on,
Yeah.
and tell them, I need help with this. What do you suggest I do?
Yeah.
And then they know it's okay.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. No, that's a great exercise. I like it.
And it's helpful too.
Yeah.
There's a little selfishness involved.
So in thinking about our colleagues out there, some are extraordinarily creative and productive and seem to find those interesting questions time and again, and others not so much. Do you have a sense for what's going on there? Is there a creative spark that some people have more of than others, or?
I'm sure there must be something innate, right? Some people are more curious than others too, right?
Could be that.
So I think there is something innate.
Uh-huh.
I think, and then innateness interacts with environment, I'm sure, in some ways. That the curious seek out the curious subject themselves constantly to creative scrutiny of others, right? And we seek out the other people we find to be kind of interesting in that way, and not the ones that, where what they're going to say is just so predictable, right? We kind of avoid that and see if we can learn something new. People differ in their risk acceptance too, right? And so people that are extraordinarily risk averse, I think also kind of find themselves working kind of, just in kind of the marginal mode a lot of times. And the people that are risk acceptant are the ones that are more likely to be, shift the paradigm just a little bit, or at least get out on a limb that doesn't have nearly as many, as much sort of intellectual supports under it that are obvious, right?
Yeah.
That is just a little bit more risky. And I just think that's, it's dangerous and risky. And often we have to remember that sometimes the first piece of research that we produce in a new vein is going to be flawed. I mean, it's going to have all kinds of shortcomings. But if it helps to launch a new literature, we just have to be happy that we can take some credit for that, as long as we don't mislead the literature in terrible directions, right? But it's more of an attitude of risk acceptance. And of course you develop that as you get older, because you can't, it's hard to take on risk really young.
Yeah, that's true. I had an interesting exchange with Alex Debs recently about this, because I had always thought, exploring a new area is risky. But his perspective was, no, that's the safe thing. Exploring doing what everyone else does is risky, because you don't know if you'll be able to find
Make a
anything.
contribution. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that turned
if you
my
do
head around a
something
little
completely new, that is true. That it's high risk, high. It's high risk, high payoff. And the ones that you see, and the ones that I see that other people said, those are the high payoff ones.
Right.
What we don't see is all the stuff that took 5 years and they finally went, forget it, forget it.
Yeah.
So it always looks like it's high. Mm-hmm. It is potentially high payoff, but it is not risk free, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of stuff ends up in the trash, and we never are deep in the hard drive somewhere, and we didn't go anywhere.
Right. Okay, here's my last question. Are there interesting and potentially important unexplored areas in political science that we have not seen because we have our disciplinary blinders on?
Oh, yes.
Or whatever. Mm-hmm.
I mean, just imagine all the things we're constantly getting wrong or not anticipating, or I don't understand why it's this way. Well, it's because it is because of that problem of blinders and filtered information and theories that tell us to look for this when we ought to have been looking for that. Mm-hmm. Let it be known for the record, my hands are moving side to side.
Yes, the hands are moving. I can testify to that.
So let me give you an example in my own field. So I just revealed that I, basically take these liberal approaches. Right. What does liberalism emphasize in international relations and in all kinds of things? Liberalism, it tends to stress universalism. So, that it doesn't. The same principles should apply kind of everywhere to everyone, right? We shouldn't be discriminating. It tends to emphasize aggregate welfare. It tends to, it doesn't concentrate too much on the distributive consequences. It's aggregate, as long as we're in the Pareto optimal world, it tends to emphasize integration. So all of these things that liberalism emphasizes, I was taking as the good thing, and we should achieve them. Universal human rights, right? We should achieve a stable international monetary system. We should achieve more integrated trade markets. And then, oh my goodness, I'm shocked that suddenly all these assumptions world over seem to be falling apart. And that's what my current project is kind of on, is this idea of sort of reestablishing the particularized. And I really do think that our way of liberal theory has made us really totally blind to space and place. And I think that we've dropped our locality out of our theories of the universal good in some sense. And I just think we didn't see some of this other stuff coming. Right. We were too busy talking about international cooperation and not thinking about who gets left behind and all of that. Right. And, well, then they can move, can't they? Oh, well, no, not so easily. They don't just want to move. Why do they need to build up border walls? Because it kind of reinforces a sense of security around them of place. Right. That this is a place preserved for us with a particular identity. And liberalism doesn't explain any of that. Yeah. And you know what else is our theories of realism, for example, again, blind us to even what people feel insecure about, right? So give me any tenet of realism that would ever have predicted that a family of 4 arriving at the U.S. border poses a security risk for the United States of America. Yeah. There's no realist theory that can do that. So our theories are, sort of, in some sense, not engaging us in the world optimally at all times. And it's at those times that we need to feel prepared to shake free a little bit of those and say, well, now there's something truly puzzling going on here, and we need some other way to understand it, even if we have to talk to anthropologists.
Well, I always think when as you were talking, I was thinking about Ken Jowett as a cautionary, no, people aren't that way.
Yeah. We should have listened. Well, I mean, we should always be listening, right? We should always be listening. Yeah. And no, I think that's. I mean, I've contributed as much as anyone to this, right? Yeah. It seems to me. Universal human rights. Oh, good. Oh, well, we're not ready to understand what the forms of backlash look like over here, right? Yeah. And it's not just state backlash, it's social backlash as well.
Yep. All right. Well, listen, thanks so much, Beth. I really appreciate this.